welcome back to Ball with Y'all. We're so excited to join y'all on yet another Monday. When we last talked, I mentioned that there would be a lot to talk about today despite a lack of premier games this past weekend, and boy, do we have a lot to cover after a wild weekend. Before we discuss the action, I want to encourage you to like, subscribe, rate, and review if your preferred platform allows. If you're a fan of us here at Ball with Y'all, you can also send us your thoughts, hot takes, or questions using the email in the description, and you can check us out on Instagram at Ball with Y'all Podcast. There's so much that happened this past weekend, I don't really know where to begin. In what appeared to be somewhat of a dull slate of games, we saw countless teams get pushed to the brink, with many faltering along the way. We had 2 AP top 10 teams lose in ugly fashion, and we also had 6 total ranked teams going down throughout the day, with 4 of those losses coming to unranked teams. Let's break down our leading storylines from Saturday with this week's weekend wind down. First off, the ACC is falling apart, and Clemson haters, they can now rejoice. Although this is an SEC-centric program, it does in fact bring me great joy to start the weekend wind down with the demise of the Clemson Tigers. The NC State Wolfpack has been a thorn in the side of the Clemson Tigers. They've been that pesky door-to-door salesman as of late for head coach Dabo Swinney's team. When I think of door-to-door salesman, I think, they go around, maybe they're selling insurance, or maybe they're selling a security system. And you hear the doorbell, and if you have one of those video cameras at your front door, you can check out to see whether you want to go to the door, or perhaps you're just not in the mood to go to the door, so you just ignore it, right? Maybe a day goes by, 2 days go by, and then they come back again. They ring the doorbell, they knock, they have their whole pitch ready for you. They have some materials on the side as well. They're ready to sell you something. And every time you ignore it, right? They keep coming and they keep coming. Eventually, either they give up or you finally open the door accidentally thinking it's something else, and then you have to talk to these people for however long, right? Well, in this case, NC State, the pesky door-to-door salesman, they came in and just broke the door down themselves. In a 27-21 win in double overtime, NC State got their first win against a top 10 team since 2012. And this is the first time that Clemson has lost 2 games in September since 2014. It also snapped a 36-game win streak against unranked opponents for the Clemson Tigers. That last loss came against the Syracuse Orange back in 2017. Clemson had been on a 8-game win streak against NC State, averaging 42.9 points per game and over 400 yards of offense in that streak. But still, NC State came out there. They had incredible ball control. As far as time of possession, NC State had almost 42 minutes of game control, whereas Clemson only had 18 minutes of the ball throughout the game. Overall, we saw NC State's quarterback Devin Leary. He won the Walter Camp National Offensive Player of the Week award, having thrown 4 passing touchdowns, which was a career high for Leary. And now looking at this on the whole, we're going to have a college football playoff this year for the first time without the Clemson Tigers since 2014. That's pretty incredible to me. And I imagine for many of you who have been looking for some degree of parity in college sports, the opportunity to not have to deal with Dabo Swinney in the playoff is a pretty exciting prospect. And if you think about Clemson's record this year, of course, they're 2-2, having lost to Georgia and having lost here to NC State. They did get 2 wins against South Carolina State and Georgia Tech, but none of those were super impressive. So keeping all that in mind, I don't even think that Clemson deserves to be ranked right now. We'll get into that here in a little bit, but a very lackluster showing here for the Clemson Tigers, and it's pretty remarkable to think about the run that they've been on, whether it's been Kelly Bryant or Deshaun Watson or Trevor Lawrence. They've been fine. The ship has been steady. But here we are in a season where we didn't really know a whole lot of what to expect. And NC State just came in and showed us exactly what we needed to see from Clemson. They were the door-to-door salesman coming in, showing that, hey, listen, you didn't want our security system, you didn't want our insurance, whatever else. We're just going to break down the door and show everyone else what's inside your house. And here we are seeing that Clemson's house is not all that pretty on the inside, and it's falling apart from the foundation as well. As far as the ACC, we also had then ranked North Carolina. They lost to Georgia Tech this week, whose only win this season, Georgia Tech, their only win this season was over an FCS school. This loss for UNC, it came from more than 3 touchdowns. The worst loss in program history since a 47-10 thrashing by the Miami Hurricanes in 2018. Many saw UNC as a preseason favorite to win the conference, but now the Tar Heels are just falling apart at the seams. And what's really interesting to see is that Mac Brown, there was a lot of intrigue when he came in as a head coach. That intrigue's starting to wear away a little bit. The shine's starting to wear off. And the results, if you just look at the numbers, are not exactly pretty for Mac Brown's team. So who's going to win the ACC? It could still be Clemson. It could be a number of teams. Right now, there are only two undefeated teams in the ACC. One of them is Wake Forest. They've crushed Florida State and Virginia, but I don't really know if they have enough. They've scored at least 35 points in each of their first 4 games, and their defense has not allowed more than 17 yet. Their defense has been very much bend, don't break. They allow a lot of points and so on. But I just don't know that they have enough in the tank to make a run for the ACC championship. Another team that's undefeated in the ACC right now is Boston College. They are 4-0 for the first time since 2007 when they got to number 2 in the AP poll. But they didn't exactly look that impressive, that incredible in an overtime win against Missouri this week at home, 41-34. Next week, though, Boston College plays at Clemson. So I think we're going to learn a lot, both about the Clemson Tigers, their resolve and so on, and also about Boston College. Is that 4-0 start a fluke? Or actually, is there something behind the scenes that they can take and maybe make a run for the conference championship? Oh, also, since we're on the topic of the ACC, I feel like it's worth mentioning Florida State is now 0-4 for the first time since 1974. So if you're a Florida State fan, you'll probably have your head coach fired here shortly. So just get ready for that. While there still are a couple teams out there, the undefeated and so on, all in all, I'd be shocked if we see the ACC represented in the playoffs. Special thanks to North Carolina State especially for helping make that a reality and breaking down that proverbial door. Our second big takeaway from this week. It might just be time to take Arkansas seriously. Arkansas has been kind of like your friend with a dry sense of humor. They're telling you something, right? And you know kind of where sometimes they might say something and you're not quite sure if there's a joke behind it or if it's meant to be funny. And so you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting. You're waiting for that punchline, right? You're waiting for like a gotcha moment. In the same way, for Arkansas, for many of us, we were waiting for the punchline. We were waiting for the gotcha. We were waiting for the, we weren't actually that real. We weren't that serious, right? We've been waiting for a gotcha for so long, but we saw this past weekend, there may not be a gotcha. And they might just be real. And this might be time to take them seriously as a contender in the SEC West and maybe even in the SEC overall. In their win against Texas A&M, they started out very hot. Of course, they held on for a 20-10 win. The game flow, it kind of reminded me in some ways of the Alabama-Florida game we saw a week ago. You start out hot, right? I believe Alabama started that game 21-3 or somewhere along those lines. Arkansas this past Saturday at one point in time, I believe they held a 17-0 lead. They started out super hot. And then they just kind of held on till the end. Their defense played great when they needed to. They battled through some injuries. We saw quarterback KJ Jefferson for the Razorbacks. He went out. It looked like a knee or an ankle issue. Also, wide receiver Traylon Burks. He's one of the best wide receivers in the country right now. He went out with an injury as well. And of course, as soon as KJ Jefferson went out with that injury, the offense became far more predictable. It was a run-first offense already. But then at that point, you knew pretty much the ball was only going to the running back until Jefferson came back in. We saw that Arkansas's defense is for real, and their offense is probably the most versatile they've been in quite some time. On the A&M side of things, we've talked about it before. They have a ton of talent, but that quarterback position is really hampering them right now. We've talked about it before with Haynes King going out with that leg injury. Zach Calzada is under center, and he has not performed up to par. The defense is really good at Texas A&M. It's gotten them as far as they have so far. But they got exposed by a run-first attack for the Arkansas Razorbacks. Moving forward, Arkansas, next up, they've got Georgia. Literally this week. Game day will be there. They've got Ole Miss after that, and Auburn as well in October. The defense is going to get tested. They didn't really get all that tested in this A&M game. Yes, A&M has skill players. But if the quarterback can't get the ball to the skill players, it doesn't really matter a whole lot. Georgia's going to test them. Ole Miss is going to test them. We'll get into Auburn here in a second, but Auburn will probably test them in some way, shape, or form as well. Regardless as to how their October unfolds, it's pretty clear to say that Arkansas's resume is pretty impressive with that win against Texas and Texas A&M as well. So I would say it might just be time to take the Razorbacks seriously. Our next top takeaway, I mentioned that Auburn, we don't really know what to expect of them right now. Brian Harsin, he's the new head coach over for the Auburn Tigers. The era of Brian Harsin is already off to a mess, right? Sometimes the grass isn't greener. I mean, you might think it's greener on the other side, right? On the other side of the fence or whatever else. But it's not always the case. And as we're seeing right now with Harsin coming in, replacing Gus Malzahn, things are not going all that well. When Gus was the coach, yes, you get 8, 9 win seasons. You probably do well in a bowl game, but some years you might be Alabama, others you wouldn't. You probably would give Georgia a run for their money, but you wouldn't necessarily be competing for conference championships or national championships. And so when you fire Gus Malzahn and say, oh, we can do better, and you bring in Brian Harsin from Boise State, you think that things will improve. And so far, I would say Gus Malzahn, he wasn't this bad. Hopefully you got to watch the game, a little bit of the game at least, between Auburn and Georgia State. The first half was not kind to Auburn. I believe they were down 24-12 at half. They were getting booed going to their locker room, but a different Tigers team came out in the second half. They ultimately winning 34-24. Special teams won Auburn the game. It wasn't their defense. It wasn't their offense. It was special teams. They had a block punt score for a touchdown. Also, they went 4 or 5 on field goals. That was the key to the game. After avoiding this scare on their homecoming game, Auburn now remains undefeated all-time against Sun Belt programs. But what was really interesting to see was that Bo Nix, the quarterback for Auburn, he got benched in favor of TJ Finley, the transfer from LSU. For a long time, Auburn fans have moaned and complained about the production from Bo Nix. And being an Alabama fan myself, I've loved Bo Nix. I thought he was great. Keep putting him out there. I think at some point, Brian Harsin's kind of gotten tired of him. Auburn fans, as I talked about, booing him into the locker room at the end of the first half. It appears that the coaching staff is just as fed up with Bo Nix as the fans and others are. But regardless of whether it's TJ Finley or Bo Nix, I'm beginning to wonder if Brian Harsin is Jeremy Pruitt 2.0. For those of you who don't know who Jeremy Pruitt is, he's now considered one of the worst hires in Tennessee history. He was the Tennessee coach. I believe he was fired this past offseason after there were a series of recruiting violations that were pretty damaging for the university. Jeremy Pruitt lost the 2019 opener at home against this same Georgia State team. And I'm not trying to say that playing a close game against Georgia State means whether you're going to be a great coach or a poor coach, but there were some pretty close parallels here. And if I'm an Auburn fan, I'm not exactly excited for the direction that Brian Harsin is taking the program right now. In the month of October, they've got to visit LSU. They've got Georgia at home. They have to visit that Arkansas team we just talked about, and then they have Ole Miss at home. So there had been a lot of excitement for the Auburn faithful, even after a loss against Penn State a week ago. But that excitement was quickly drained out of the Auburn faithful as they booed the team going into that halftime locker room. So if I'm an Auburn fan, yes, we got to win against Georgia State. That's awesome. But moving forward, you've got quite the test in the month of October, and you better hope that TJ Finley's the answer, because it certainly is not Bo Nix. Our last main takeaway from this past weekend, you might have seen the headline where it said that college football playoff expansion was probably going to get delayed. And in my opinion, the beneficiary of this delayed college football playoff expansion is the SEC. It came out last week, like I mentioned, that the expected vote on a 12-team playoff format was not going to happen this week after all. Those in the committee, they're saying that there's more details that need to be worked out. But essentially what's happening is that everything was fine until Oklahoma and Texas announced that they had intent to join the SEC. Now, other conferences, other individuals that are on that committee are putting their foot down, delaying the process until they get what they want. We don't really know what that is quite yet, but here's the deal. The SEC, they're fine with a 4-team playoff format. They've won 4 out of 7 national championships under this format, and they've had at least one team in the Final Four every year. Whether it's 12 teams or 6 or 8 teams, whenever that happens, the SEC will probably dominate that too, just based off the talent on the field alone. So as long as there are at-large bids available and that there are not too many automatic bids, the SEC will be fine in the new format whenever it comes. So if you're another conference commissioner that's looking to delay things and you keep sticking your feet in the ground trying to delay the process, just know that the only opportunities that you are limiting right now are your own. The SEC is just fine wherever the format goes. And that's our weekend wind down. We also had a new AP poll come out yesterday. There were a lot of intriguing moves in that poll. We saw Alabama and Georgia. They held firm at the top once again. Oklahoma and Penn State, they switched spots after Oklahoma struggled against West Virginia, now sitting at number 6 and Penn State sitting at number 4. Arkansas, they rose 8 spots to number 8 after a very strong showing against Texas A&M, their first top 10 appearance since 2012. Notre Dame, they moved back into the top 10, now sitting at number 9 after a gritty win against Wisconsin. Texas A&M, like we talked about, they dropped 8 spots after their lackluster effort against the Razorbacks. And Clemson, the Clemson Tigers, I opened the show with them. They plummeted down the rankings, now sitting in the last spot, number 25, the first time in 97 weeks they've been outside the top 10. There were 7 SEC teams ranked, including 4 in the top 10, 6 in the top 15. We also had a few new entrants. Oklahoma State, after a big win against Kansas State, sitting at number 19. Baylor, after upsetting, then at number 14. Iowa State at number 21 now. North Carolina State, after that big win against the Clemson Tigers, now sitting at number 23. And Wake Forest, one of the 2 remaining undefeated ACC teams, sitting at number 24. As far as some notable results that we would take away from this past weekend, we saw Wisconsin and Notre Dame. They played up in Soldier Field, and Notre Dame went out there and played their hearts out, winning 41-13. Brian Kelly, he passed Newt Rockne for the most wins in Notre Dame history, and a big part of that was Notre Dame's defense and special teams units. They alone outscored both offenses in the game. Notre Dame's defense, they held Wisconsin to 2.8 yards per carry, forcing 5 turnovers in the process. They had a masterful fourth quarter. They scored 2 touchdowns, forced 4 turnovers, and allowed 0 points in the final 14 minutes. I think this is the first complete performance we've seen from Notre Dame this year, and it's the momentum that they needed going into next week's massive game against Cincinnati. We also saw Georgia. They went on the road, visited Vanderbilt, and thrashed the Vanderbilt Commodores 62-0. Georgia was covering before the first quarter even ended. They were covering 12 minutes into the game. Of course, you might remember the spread was around 32.5. For a while, Georgia had more points than Vanderbilt had yards until about halfway into the fourth quarter. Vanderbilt finished with 77 yards, and Georgia, of course, had 62 points. Vanderbilt averaged 1.7 yards per play. Georgia also had twice as many touchdowns as Vanderbilt had first downs throughout the game. This was definitely a case of bad Vanderbilt, not just good Georgia, although Georgia was very impressive without a doubt. Vanderbilt just might be one of the worst football teams in college football history. So I don't know that 62-0 final score is actually a representation of Georgia and their potential, but still pretty impressive nonetheless. That defense has still only allowed 1 touchdown on the year, which was, of course, to South Carolina a couple weeks ago. This is Georgia's largest margin of victory since the 66-0 win over Troy in 2014. Next week, like I talked about earlier, they've got Arkansas, and this will be the first real opportunity for us to see who Georgia really is. Now we see that Clemson game, it wasn't exactly up to the significance that we might have expected. So I think this Arkansas game upcoming this weekend will be a true barometer for us to see where Georgia's at and how far they can go. Sticking in the SEC, we also saw LSU take on Mississippi State and them winning 28-25 on the road. For the Bulldogs, there were too many self-inflicted errors. They had penalties negating pivotal plays. They had turnovers, including one early. Their defenders were literally tackling each other at some points in time, and there were some pretty egregious blown coverages as well. On the LSU side, their defense looked really good, even without their star player, Derek Stingley Jr. The defense was disciplined until the very end when they gave up those 3 touchdown drives to end the game. The LSU offense, they started off pretty slow as well, but Max Johnson put up a second-half performance that made him the first LSU quarterback since Rohan Davey to throw 3 touchdowns of over 40 yards in the same game. The pass-heavy offense looks to be a staple moving forward, and it relies on Max Johnson to become comfortable in that pocket. And it appears that he's getting there as the games go along. With a number of big games coming up, I would say that LSU just needs to work on finishing. They need to work on that death blow, putting teams away. If I'm an LSU fan, though, regardless of how close that game ended up, I'm still walking away pretty encouraged. Our last notable SEC game of the week, we saw Kentucky go down to visit South Carolina. Kentucky, they went out there, won 16-10. It wasn't exactly pretty by any stretch of the imagination, but they are now 4-0 entering October for the first time since 2018. Like I mentioned, it was not exactly a pretty game. Kentucky made a ton of mistakes, but they got away with it. And ultimately speaking, that's what matters. They made a ton of mistakes. They went -3 in the turnover margin. Now they're -9 on the season, but their defense showed up when the offense did everything in their power to lose that game. South Carolina, they ran for 300 yards a year ago when they faced off against Kentucky. This week, only 58 yards on the ground. So dating back to last season, Kentucky has now won their last 6 games, 4 games this year, 2 games last year, and they haven't won 7 straight since 1977. So to answer Nick on social media, he asked us a little bit about the Kentucky Wildcats. What do we think of them? Coming up, Kentucky's got Florida, LSU, Georgia, and Mississippi State in October. So if they want to get 7 straight or even just have a good showing in the month of October, they have to clean up their turnovers. They got away with it against a bad South Carolina team this week. They won't get away with it against Florida. They won't get away with it against LSU. They definitely won't get away with it against Georgia, and they won't get away with it against Mississippi State as well. So if I'm a Kentucky fan, we need to clean up the mistakes and do it quick. If you want to give these teams a run for their money, especially some of these more prominent teams, some of these ranked teams, you have to limit your turnovers, and you need to do it basically this week because you got Florida up next. Week 4 gave us a lot of entertaining football, and it also helped give the playoff picture a more defined shape as we move ahead. Looking ahead to next week, of course, there are a number of pretty prominent games. We've got Georgia, Arkansas, Ole Miss, Alabama, and more. Remember, on Thursday, we will discuss all of those. We'll preview all those matchups, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Have a great Monday, and as always, thanks for allowing us to kick off your week by talking some ball with y'all.